Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to span the range of the first 10 chapters of Matthew's 27th chapter. Herein we read of Judas's death and doom, his suicide, and Judas himself enjoys the dubious distinction of perhaps being amongst the most reviled human villains, at least in the Bible, in history, but he's also one of the more fascinating. He is a fascinating figure of what made him do what he did, why did he do it, who was he? These are a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to, but we should be asking. But we do have some information. He's not commented on extensively enough to form sufficient fund of biographical material, but we do observe certain traits in his behavior. And we just want to open with the three passages from the preceding chapter, the 26th, that explain what he did. And I want you to focus on who he is. That is why he is doing what he is doing. So the 14th verse reads, "Then one of the 12, called Judas from Iscariot, went to the high priest. There were two of the 12 known as Judas. The other one in John's 14th chapter, he signifies that he is not referring to the one from Iscariot, but this Judas from Iscariot, that's the town from which his ancestor came that formed the crux of his last name, went to the high priest. And what did he tell him? What did he do there? And said, 'What would you give me to deliver him to you?' And they counted out to him 30 pieces of silver." So there's the question, there's the answer. He's going to betray his master. He's offering him his service in exchange for a financial sum, 30 pieces of silver. That would have been the price of a slave in the ancient world. So Judas was a covetous man. He was the thief he was entrusted to guard the disciples' traveling funds, and he pilfered off some of the sums for himself. And from then on went seeking an occasion to deliver him up. So from there on out, he is committed, he is bound by the money he has accepted for the service he has agreed to in arrangement of receiving the down payment. Then the 21st through 25th verse, "And while they were eating," this is in the Last Supper, "while they were eating, he said, 'Truly I say to you, one of you shall deliver me up.'" So he's not taken by surprise when they come in the Garden of Gethsemane on the very same night. He's telling them right now that he already knows that one of them has set into his heart to betray him. "And they were deeply grieved and began to say to him, each of them, 'Master, is it I?'" So these other disciples are perplexed and bewildered by the mere suggestion that one of them, seated among them, would deliver him up. That means betray him. And so they have rigorous introspection, and they genuinely ask, "Is it I? Do I have this in me? One of us here? You must explain, like, which one of us?" And he answering said, "He who has dipped his hand with me in the dish, he shall deliver me up." So that is a fulfillment of Psalm 41:9. "I have broken bread with my friend. He has betrayed me. Indeed, the Son of Man goes, it has been written concerning him. But woe unto that man by whom this Son of Man is delivered up. It would have not been good for that man if he had been born. And Judah, who he delivered him up, answering said, 'Rabbi, is it I?' And he said to him, 'You have said it.'" So what's significant here is that the disciples ask the same question that Judas himself asked after this statement, that this must be fulfilled along with the prophecy, and it is the prophetic and providential will of his Father, which he is always in tune with and always aware of. Then we read in the Garden of Gethsemane, read a lot of things that we can barely scratch the surface on this chapter, which comes before us. Peter is also told that he will forsake his master 3 times, and the cock will crow and he will know. And what we witness in between Peter and Judas is the difference between repentance on Peter's behalf and mere remorse on Judas's behalf. We'll save that thought for later. Hold it there. So they're in the garden, and while he was speaking, see, Judas, one of the 12, with a large crowd with swords and clubs, came from the high priest and elders of the people. So what would this man be doing, this disciple, walking with an angry crowd of armed men with the authority of the chief priest and with the weight of the Sanhedrin? Why would he be doing such a thing? And he who was delivering him up gave him with a sign, saying, Whomever I kiss it, it is he, seize him. So he's telling him he's going to signal his betrayal with the signal of a kiss. That is the customary greeting of friendship and farewell in the first century Palestine. And going straight up to Yahshua, he said, Greetings, Rabbi, and kissed him. So he signaled his betrayal with a kiss. He kissed him, they seized him, they drove him to trial. They conducted this is at nighttime, and they conducted their trial against the Sanhedrin, against the law of Moses. So they could not, or the Sanhedrin, one of them, they couldn't conduct a trial at night. But on that night, we witnessed the fulfillment of Peter's failure, his ultimate failure, his denial of his master in his hour of greatest needs, when he had earlier presumptuously boasted that he would follow him to the end. But he repented and was given the chance to die for the master's sake. And Judas died for himself, and he committed suicide. So that just means, imagine what it would compel a man. He had the most notorious betrayal in human history had just been served by him, and the consequences of his actions hit him almost immediately, as we read. So, in morning having come, all the chief priests and elders of the people took counsel against Yahshua, so as to put him to death. So, because they had conducted their illegal trial in night, the morning was the hour when they could officially level the charge which they had concluded in the trial they had already conducted at night. And the problem of putting him to death, now the Jewish people could not execute even one of their own without the oversight, permission, and authority of Rome. So they had to turn, capital punishment was beyond their jurisdiction, so they had to turn him over to the Romans. They had just indicted him through an erroneous interpretation of his words of blasphemy and his claims, but that's not going to fly with the Roman people. They don't even care about the religious. They keep a deliberate, respectful remove from the religions of their captive people. This was aligned with the ancient premise of polytheism, whereby which each god was thought to be dominant in their respective jurisdiction, territory, or element, and as such was to be received in reverence whenever you were on his turf. So, having bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor. Now we read of what takes place after there, but just after these 10 verses we're going to cover, I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version. They accuse him of being a rabble-rouser, an agitator, of being kings of the Jews, so that claim would be interpreted as treason, because he was acclaimed and he did not deny that he was the Messiah. But it's in John's 18th chapter where we read of the most revealing conversation of the nature of his kingdom in this exchange. Then Judas, he who delivered him up, having seen that he had been condemned, repented, returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priest and to the elders. Now the word repented in this translation is curious, but that just signals he physically repented in some sense of what he had accepted. He had returned the money, even though the deed had already been done. There's no amount. You can't just exchange a betrayal like that and return the money and expect your conscience to be clear. But he really, the difference between him and Peter is the difference between repentance and remorse. And he gives lip service to repentance. Why don't we just read the fourth verse, saying, I have sinned in delivering up innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. So they don't care that he's conflicted in his conscience. They don't care that as far as they knew, they had entered into arrangement. They had performed their part on their half when they paid Judas this and had delivered him to him. So as far as they were concerned, the deed was done. They did not. These were the religious rulers. These, of all people, out of respect for their office, if nothing else, might have been inclined to the spiritual welfare of a sick sinner in need. And, no man is beyond redemption. So even if Judas did the authentic repentance, perhaps he may have, but it would have been impossible here. So that's ultimately idle speculation. I do try and stay away from that stuff, but yet fall trap to it from time to time. And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he left and went and hanged himself. Now, before I elaborate on the meaning of this verse, I just want to here discourage the practice of baby believers from turning to arbitrarily physically turning, picking up a page and then reading that chapter or that whatever's on that page, because the allegorical story of the person who turned to this, he was perplexed and dilemmaed in solution. This is certainly an extreme hypothetical, but he was seeking answers from the Bible. He turned to this one, and by happenstance, he turned on to Matthew 27:5, where he hung himself, and the reader proceeded just to do that. That's an extreme allegory, an extreme hypothetical, but when that situation arises, I think it's best to get them grounded in reading one proverb a day. There's one for every month of the year. And most months of the year have 31 days in them. There's 31 chapters in that book, and you can sneak in 31 on the 30th day of the month, but that establishes the repetition and continuity of daily guidelines they can think on and dwell on. It's not too thick with theological jargon. It does carry a few theological assumptions, but even the non-believer can benefit from reading the book of Proverbs as philosophy, but we read it a little differently. Now to the verse itself. There was nothing left to live for. He was hopeless. That's why people commit suicide. They are bereft of any hope or solution or answer. And I personally don't believe that a suicidal thought can enter into a born-again mind, a truly born-again mind, or sufficiently for them to dwell on it, enough to entertain it, because our heart has been redeemed. So in that lens, we appreciate the magnitude that Judas was lost, what the Master had warned about earlier in the 26th chapter about woe unto him. It would have been better if he had never been born. And Judas has nothing to live for at this point. So he is implicitly affirming that statement we earlier read. And the chief priest took the silver pieces and said, "It is not right to put them in the treasury, seeing they are the price of blood." So they had, the Jews had this funny thing, this odd aversion to blood. It ceremonially defiled anything, yet the blood was also exalted and uplifted as the means of atonement. So animal blood was okay, but blood outside the temple in a non-Levitically performed sacrifice that just ceremonially defiled one thing. So they knew that they had blood on their hands, and to accept this money was to accept the argument that they did in fact have blood on their hands. So they took it and donated it. They deflected it to another cause, shall we say. So they took counsel and brought with them the potter's field for the burial of strangers. So Gentiles, they were deemed unclean, yet they had their own separate graveyards, because the Jews, even their dead, they had the hope for the resurrection, at least by this point. Yeah, that would have been, since the Old Testament, it's been a matter of faith for the Jewish people. But the Gentiles were still considered unclean, and as such, their contaminating proximate presence to the Jews would have demanded and necessitated that they have their own separate separoni. So the Jews were literalist about the separatist doctrine. They literally wanted nothing to do with Gentiles. Maybe an unfair caricature, but the majority of them did not. Therefore, that field has been called the field of blood until today. So this is written in approximately the year before the temple was destroyed, I believe Matthew was written, or maybe it might have been slightly after, but in any case, Mark does predict in his 13th chapter what is repeated in Matthew and Luke in the Mount Olivet discourses, the destruction of the temple. And that was written in 65 AD after the death of Peter, which motivated the writing of it. So then was filled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, And they took 30 pieces of silver, the price of him who was pierced, on whom they of the children of Israel put a price. So 600 years ago, Jeremiah uttered something, and it may have had an immediate fulfillment, but prophecy echoes throughout the ages, and Matthew is writing to a primarily Jewish audience who would have been familiar, and so he references Old Testament prophets with more frequency than any other gospel author, and Jeremiah did say something to this effect. I forget the precise chapter. I think it's in the 32nd chapter. I could be wrong, but in any case, the significance is the echo and the fulfillment of what was written 600 years ago, coming to pass in the author of the New Testament, connecting it based on the writings of the Old, thus giving salience to the arguments of equal inspiration. And gave them for the potter's field, as Yahweh had ordered me. So that's just the conclusion of the quote. So this was providentially arranged. It upsets a lot of people to calculate the fact that it was in the will of the Father that his son would suffer. But Judah came to suffer even before him. So we haven't even read of what happens during the same day. So this is probably before noon that he's even, I think he was hung on the cross at noon. And hung, you know what, I forget all about that. We're just going to close the lesson here and now. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.